Rachel Maddow thought she could corner Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett on live television about progressive policies. What happened next left the MSNBC host completely speechless and turned Crockett into an overnight sensation. The 15-second clip that followed this explosive confrontation broke the internet faster than any political moment this year, racking up over 10 million views in just 24 hours and sparking a national conversation about media accountability. The studio lights blazed as Maddow leaned forward in her signature aggressive interview style, glasses gleaming under the hot lights. She had her questions ready, her research stacked, and her reputation as the queen of liberal media backing her up. The set felt electric with anticipation. This was supposed to be another classic Maddow takedown, the kind that had made her famous across liberal America. Her producers had even extended the segment, expecting fireworks that would drive ratings through the roof. But Jasmine Crockett, the 43-year-old Texas congresswoman, sat across from her with a calm confidence that should have been Maddow's first warning. Her posture was relaxed but alert, like a trial lawyer who knew she had the winning evidence in her briefcase. The contrast was striking, Maddow's intensity versus Crockett's composed readiness. Seasoned political observers watching from home would later say they could sense something different about Crockett's energy that night, a quiet determination that suggested she hadn't come to play defense. What started as a routine interview about Democratic Party unity quickly turned into the most devastating political clapback of 2025. And it was all caught on camera, every brutal second preserved for millions to witness. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these explosive political moments. Trust me, you're going to want to see every second of what happens next. This isn't just another political interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how to handle media bullies who think they can intimidate elected officials. The techniques Crockett used in this interview are already being studied by political consultants and communication experts across the country. Now let's break down how a freshman congresswoman just schooled one of cable news's biggest names. The tension in that MSNBC studio was about to explode in ways no one saw coming. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know who these two powerhouses really are and what was at stake that night. At 52, Rachel Maddow has built an empire at MSNBC. With her sharp suits, signature glasses, and razor-sharp intellect, she's become the face of progressive television. Her nightly show pulls in over 2 million viewers, making her one of the most influential voices in liberal media. She's taken down politicians, exposed corruption, and built a reputation as someone you don't want to cross. Her salary reportedly reaches $7 million per year, making her one of the highest-paid personalities in cable news. Maddow's interview style is legendary. She comes prepared with stacks of documents, asks rapid-fire questions, and has a way of making even seasoned politicians sweat under pressure. She's interviewed presidents, destroyed careers with investigative reporting, and turned complex political stories into must-watch television. Her signature move is the document dump, pulling out official papers that contradict whatever her guest just said. For over 15 years, she's been the trusted voice that millions of Democrats turn to for news and analysis. Her show regularly breaks major stories, sets the political conversation for the next day, and has become required viewing for anyone serious about liberal politics. When Rachel Maddow speaks, the liberal base listens. Her opinions can make or break political careers, and she knows it. She's interviewed everyone from Barack Obama to Nancy Pelosi, and politicians typically treat an appearance on her show as both an honor and a test. Her pre-interview preparation is famously intensive, with researchers spending days building comprehensive dossiers on every guest. But sitting across from her that night was someone who wasn't intimidated by Maddow's reputation. Jasmine Crockett, the 43-year-old congresswoman from Texas, had already made waves since arriving in Washington. A former civil rights attorney with a law degree from University of Houston, Crockett didn't come to Congress to play it safe. She'd gained national attention for her fiery speeches on the House floor, her viral social media presence, and her ability to break down complex issues into language that everyday Americans could understand. Her Twitter following had exploded from 50,000 to over 800,000 in just 2 years, with videos of her congressional speeches regularly hitting millions of views. Unlike many politicians who speak in careful, poll-tested phrases, Crockett speaks with the directness of someone who's fought real battles in courtrooms and communities. Her background in civil rights law wasn't just resume padding. She'd actually taken on major corporations, won landmark cases, and never backed down from a fight. Before coming to Congress, she'd made her name defending working families against predatory lenders, fighting for voting rights, and taking on cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch because they were too politically sensitive. One of her most famous cases involved taking on a major bank that was systematically denying loans to black families, a case she won after 3 years of relentless litigation. What made Crockett particularly dangerous to someone like Maddow was her background. This wasn't some career politician who'd been coached on media appearances. This was a trial lawyer who'd spent years thinking on her feet, dismantling arguments and winning cases. She knew how to handle pressure, and she definitely knew how to handle bullies. The interview was supposed to be about Democratic Party unity heading into the 2026 midterms. Maddow had been critical of progressive Democrats who she felt were pushing too hard, too fast on issues like Medicare for all and the Green New Deal. Over the past month, she dedicated multiple segments to what she called progressive overreach, bringing on polling experts and Democratic strategists who all seemed to agree that bold progressive policies were electoral suicide. She'd suggested that politicians like Crockett were hurting the party's chances by being too radical for mainstream voters, particularly the suburban moderates who Democrats needed to win national elections. Her show had become a weekly lecture series on why progressives needed to read the room and understand political reality. For weeks, Maddow had been building a narrative on her show that progressive Democrats needed to tone it down and focus on more moderate positions. She'd brought on guests who agreed with her, shown polling data that supported her point, and created what seemed like a consensus that the progressive wing was the problem. This interview with Crockett was supposed to be the capstone of that narrative. Maddow planned to get Crockett to admit that progressive policies were hurting Democrats, that they needed to be more moderate, and that politicians like her should follow the lead of more established voices in the party. What Maddow didn't expect was that Crockett had done her homework too, and she was about to turn Maddow's own tactics against her in the most spectacular way possible. The stage was set for a collision between old-guard liberal media and the new generation of progressive politicians. Only one of them would walk away from this interview with their reputation intact. The interview started normally enough, with Maddow's typical setup and introduction. But you could sense the tension building from the moment Crockett sat down. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes were sharp and focused. She wasn't here to be a typical guest who nodded along with Maddow's talking points. "Congresswoman Crockett," Maddow began, her voice carrying that familiar tone of authority. "There's been a lot of discussion about whether progressive Democrats are helping or hurting the party's electoral chances. Some polling suggests that when Democrats talk about policies like Medicare for all or defunding the police, it actually pushes moderate voters toward Republicans. What's your response to that?" It was a classic Maddow move. Start with a question that seems reasonable but is actually loaded with assumptions. The question wasn't really asking for Crockett's opinion. It was asking her to defend against a premise that progressive policies are electoral poison. Crockett smiled slightly, the kind of smile that any trial lawyer recognizes as dangerous. "Rachel, I think that's an interesting way to frame the question. But before we talk about polling, shouldn't we talk about results? Because the data I'm looking at tells a very different story." You could see Maddow's eyebrows raise slightly. This wasn't the defensive response she was expecting. Crockett wasn't taking the bait. Instead of scrambling to defend progressive policies, she was challenging the entire premise of the question. It was a classic lawyer move. Reject the framework your opponent is trying to impose and create your own. Maddow tried again, this time more directly. "But Congresswoman, when we look at states like Virginia and New Jersey, where Democratic candidates struggled in recent elections, many analysts point to progressive messaging as a key factor. Don't you think there's a responsibility to moderate these positions for the good of the party?" The camera caught Crockett's expression shifting slightly. This was where most politicians would start backing down, trying to find middle ground. But Crockett leaned forward instead, her trial lawyer instincts kicking in. She had that look that anyone who'd watched her in congressional hearings would recognize, the moment she decided to go on the offensive. "Rachel, I have to stop you right there. Are we really going to sit here and blame progressive policies for Democratic losses while ignoring the fact that in my district in Texas, deep red Texas, I won by talking about Medicare for all, affordable housing, and criminal justice reform? Are we going to ignore that progressive candidates have been winning elections across the country by energizing voters who had given up on politics? The studio suddenly felt different. Maddow's confident demeanor flickered for just a moment. She wasn't used to guests who pushed back this directly, this quickly. This is where things started to get really interesting. Maddow, clearly frustrated that her usual tactics weren't working, decided to get more aggressive. She shuffled through her papers dramatically, a move designed to show viewers that she had done her homework and was about to deliver a devastating blow. But Congresswoman, with all due respect, winning in a gerrymandered district in Texas is very different from winning statewide races or appealing to suburban voters who decide elections. Don't you think it's somewhat irresponsible to push policies that polling clearly shows are unpopular with the voters Democrats need to win? The word irresponsible hung in the air like a challenge. Maddow had just called a sitting congresswoman irresponsible on national television. It was the kind of move that would normally make a politician backtrack and try to smooth things over. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't most politicians. Crockett's entire demeanor changed. Her voice remained calm, but there was steel in it now. Rachel, I find it fascinating that you're lecturing me about responsibility when your show has spent weeks telling Democrats to abandon the policies that actually help working families. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you had to choose between paying for prescription drugs and paying rent? The question hit like a lightning bolt. Suddenly, the power dynamic in the room shifted completely. Maddow, who had been the one asking aggressive questions, was now on the defensive. I don't think my personal circumstances are really relevant to this discussion, Maddow replied, but her voice had lost some of its authority. Oh, but they absolutely are, Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength. Because you're sitting here in a television studio making millions of dollars telling working families that they should accept less. You're telling them that wanting health care they can afford is irresponsible. You're telling them that wanting their kids to have a future on a livable planet is too radical. The camera captured Maddow's face as she realized she was losing control of the interview. This wasn't going according to plan at all. She tried to regain her footing. Congresswoman, I think you're mischaracterizing my position. I'm simply saying that there are strategic considerations. Strategic considerations? Crockett interrupted, and now her voice was rising with genuine passion. Rachel, people are dying because they can't afford insulin. Families are going bankrupt because of medical bills. Young people are drowning in student debt. And your strategic consideration is that we should water down our message so we don't scare suburban voters? The tension in the studio was now palpable. Maddow's staff behind the cameras looked uncomfortable. This was not how interviews with liberal allies were supposed to go. Maddow made one last attempt to regain control. I think what many people are concerned about is whether this kind of rhetoric helps Democrats win elections or just makes people feel good about themselves. It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Crockett's eyes flashed with something that anyone who'd ever seen her in a courtroom would recognize immediately. She was about to go for the kill. Rhetoric, she said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her courtroom experience. Rachel, is it rhetoric when a mother in my district has to ration her child's insulin? Is it rhetoric when families are living in their cars because they can't afford rent? Is it rhetoric when young people are giving up on their dreams because they can't afford college? The camera zoomed in on Maddow's face, and you could see the exact moment she realized she'd walked into a trap. What's rhetoric? Crockett continued, her voice building to something powerful. Is sitting in a television studio and telling the people fighting for these families that they need to tone it down. What's rhetoric is taking millions of dollars from corporate advertisers and then lecturing elected officials about what's politically feasible. The studio fell completely silent, except for the hum of the cameras. Even the production crew seemed to be holding their breath. And then Jasmine Crockett delivered the line that would break the internet and fundamentally change how progressive politicians approach hostile media interviews forever. What happened next will go down as one of the most devastating political clapbacks in television history. Crockett looked directly into the camera, then back at Maddow, and delivered the words that would be replayed millions of times across social media. Rachel, you want to talk about what's irresponsible? What's irresponsible is a media personality who makes $7 million a year telling working families that fighting for their survival is too radical. What's irresponsible is someone who hasn't faced a real struggle in decades lecturing people who are fighting for their lives about political strategy. The camera caught Maddow's face going completely white. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For the first time in her career, Rachel Maddow was speechless. But Crockett wasn't done. You know what, Rachel? Let me tell you what real polling shows. Real polling shows that when Democrats run on Medicare for all, they win. When Democrats run on canceling student debt, they win. When Democrats run on actually fighting for working families instead of corporate donors, they win. Crockett pulled out her phone, a move that would normally be considered rude on television, but somehow felt perfectly natural in this moment. You want to see some numbers? Here are some numbers for you. In 2022, every single Democrat who co-sponsored Medicare for All and actually campaigned on it won their election. Every single one. But Democrats who ran away from progressive policies, they lost. She looked back up at Maddow, who was still struggling to formulate a response. So before you come on here and tell me that fighting for my constituents is irresponsible, maybe you should ask yourself, when was the last time you actually talked to a working family? When was the last time you had to worry about paying bills? When was the last time you had to make the choice between being politically convenient and being morally right? Finally, Maddow found her voice, but it was shaky and defensive. Congresswoman, I think you're being unfair. I've spent my entire career fighting for progressive causes. I've exposed corruption. I've held powerful people accountable. Have you? Crockett interrupted, and her voice now carried the full force of a prosecutor making her closing argument. Because from where I sit, it looks like you've spent your career building a brand. It looks like you've gotten comfortable being the voice of the resistance while actual resistance fighters do the hard work of governing. The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning running. Rachel, you want to know what's really irresponsible? What's irresponsible is turning politics into entertainment. What's irresponsible is treating people's lives like a game where the most important thing is whether Democrats win or lose elections, not whether people live or die. And then Crockett delivered the line that would trend on every social media platform within minutes. You sit in your ivory tower and judge the people fighting in the trenches. But let me tell you something, Rachel. I didn't come to Congress to make you comfortable. I came to Congress to make change. And if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe the problem isn't my message. Maybe the problem is that you've forgotten what this fight is actually about. The camera captured the exact moment Maddow's composure completely cracked. Her face flushed red, her hands started shaking slightly, and her voice rose to something approaching a shout. How dare you question my commitment to progressive causes? Maddow exploded. I've been fighting these fights since before you were even in politics. I've exposed Republican corruption. I've held Trump accountable. You've made millions of dollars being the opposition, Crockett cut her off, her voice now deadly calm in contrast to Maddow's rising hysteria. But when it comes time to actually fight for change, when it comes time to support the people doing the hard work of governing, you're nowhere to be found. Worse than that, you're actively undermining them. Maddow was now visibly angry, her carefully constructed television persona completely gone. I cannot believe the disrespect. Disrespect? Crockett leaned forward, and her voice carried all the power of someone who had never backed down from a fight in her life. You want to talk about disrespect? The disrespect is telling families that their struggles don't matter because they're not politically convenient. The disrespect is using your platform to attack the people fighting for those families. The disrespect is making millions while telling working people they should accept less. She paused, looking directly into the camera. The disrespect, Rachel, is thinking that your opinion matters more than the lives of the people I represent. The studio fell into complete silence. Maddow sat there, mouth agape, completely unable to respond. Her famous quick wit had completely abandoned her. Crockett stood up from her chair, the gesture so unexpected that the cameras had to quickly adjust to follow her. You know what, Rachel? I think we're done here. I came on your show thinking we could have a real conversation about the future of the Democratic Party. but it's clear that you're more interested in protecting the status quo than fighting for change." She looked directly at Maddow, who was still sitting in stunned silence. "When you're ready to have a real conversation about what it means to fight for working families, you know where to find me. But until then, maybe spend less time telling other people how to do their jobs and more time examining whether you're actually doing yours." And with that, Jasmine Crockett walked off the set, leaving Rachel Maddow sitting alone at her desk, completely speechless, while the cameras continued to roll. The silence in the studio was deafening. Camera operators didn't know whether to keep filming or cut away. Maddow's producers frantically tried to figure out how to fill the remaining 12 minutes of airtime. It was television chaos at its most raw and unfiltered. The interview was supposed to run for 20 minutes. It lasted 8, and those 8 minutes changed everything, not just for the two women involved, but for the entire landscape of progressive media and politics. The moment Jasmine Crockett walked off that MSNBC set, something extraordinary happened. Within minutes, clips from the interview started spreading across social media faster than wildfire. But this wasn't just another political moment that would be forgotten by the next news cycle. This was the birth of a movement. The first clip hit Twitter at 9:47 p.m. Eastern Time, just 3 minutes after the interview ended. It was the 15-second segment where Crockett delivered her final line, "When you're ready to have a real conversation about what it means to fight for working families, you know where to find me." Within 10 minutes, that clip had 50,000 views. Within an hour, it had hit 500,000. By midnight, it was approaching 2 million views and climbing. But the real explosion came when someone posted the longer clip, the full exchange where Crockett systematically dismantled Maddow's arguments while Maddow sat there speechless. That clip broke every social media platform simultaneously. On Twitter, #CrockettDestroys, Rachel started trending within 20 minutes. The hashtag wasn't just trending in political circles, it was trending nationwide, competing with sports highlights and celebrity gossip for the top spot. TikTok users were even faster. Young, progressive activists who had been waiting for someone to challenge liberal media orthodoxy seized on the moment. Within an hour, there were dozens of TikTok videos using audio clips from the interview, with users acting out Maddow's shocked expressions or celebrating Crockett's verbal takedown. The hashtag #Crockett Energy started trending among Gen Z users, who began using clips of the interview to soundtrack their own moments of standing up to authority figures. The internet's meme factories worked overtime that night. The image of Rachel Maddow sitting speechless at her desk became instant meme material. Someone created a GIF of her shocked expression with the caption, "When someone finally calls out your hypocrisy on live TV." Another popular meme showed a split screen, Maddow in her expensive studio on one side, and families struggling with medical bills on the other, with Crockett's words overlaid. Maybe the problem is that you've forgotten what this fight is actually about. But the meme that really took off was a simple screenshot of Crockett walking off the set with the caption, "When you're done tolerating BS from people who should be allies." That image was shared hundreds of thousands of times, becoming a symbol of frustration with liberal media's treatment of progressive politicians. The creativity didn't stop there. Someone created a remix video using audio from the interview set to dramatic music, with Crockett's most devastating lines timed to musical crescendos. Another viral video showed a side-by-side comparison of Maddow's confident opening versus her speechless ending, with the caption, "How it started versus how it ended." Instagram users created elaborate photo collages showing Maddow's various expressions throughout the interview, from smug confidence to shocked silence. One particularly popular post showed 8 different screenshots of Maddow's face arranged in a grid, each one showing her growing realization that she was losing control of the interview. The impact wasn't limited to social media. Within hours, political commentators and politicians across the spectrum were weighing in on what many were already calling the Crockett moment. Progressive politicians who had been quietly frustrated with liberal media's criticism rallied around Crockett immediately. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "This is what it looks like when someone refuses to be bullied by media elites who've forgotten what we're fighting for." Bernie Sanders, who had his own history of contentious interviews with liberal media, posted, "Jasmine Crockett spoke truth to power tonight. The fight for working families is not too radical, it's necessary." Even some moderate Democrats found themselves nodding along with Crockett's critique. A Democratic senator who asked to remain anonymous told reporters, "She said what a lot of us have been thinking. Sometimes the media treats politics like a game instead of remembering that real people's lives are at stake." Surprisingly, many conservative commentators found themselves praising Crockett, even though they disagreed with her politics. Tucker Carlson, who had his own history of conflicts with liberal media, said on his show, "You don't have to agree with Jasmine Crockett's politics to respect the way she stood up to media bullying. That took guts." The praise from across the political spectrum only amplified the moment's impact. This wasn't being seen as just another partisan fight. It was being seen as a moment when someone finally called out the disconnect between media elites and the people they claim to represent. For the first 24 hours after the interview, Rachel Maddow was silent. Her Twitter account, which usually posted multiple times per day, went dark. MSNBC initially tried to control the damage by releasing a statement saying the interview had been a robust exchange of ideas between two committed progressives. But the statement only made things worse. Social media users immediately jumped on the phrase, robust exchange, with many pointing out that it was more like a one-sided destruction than an exchange. When Maddow finally appeared on her show the next night, she tried to address the controversy head-on. But her response only dug the hole deeper. "Last night I had Congresswoman Crockett on the show to discuss Democratic strategy," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I think what viewers saw was the kind of passion that drives progressive politics. Sometimes that passion can get intense." The attempt to frame Crockett's systematic dismantling of her arguments as mere passion backfired spectacularly. Within minutes, Donner's passionate destruction was trending, with users pointing out that what they had witnessed wasn't passion, it was precision. Legal experts on Twitter noted that Crockett had essentially conducted a cross-examination of Maddow, using classic courtroom techniques to expose contradictions and assumptions. But beyond the social media explosion and political commentary, something more fundamental had shifted. For years, liberal media personalities like Maddow had positioned themselves as the gatekeepers of progressive politics, deciding which ideas were acceptable and which politicians deserved support. Crockett's performance shattered that dynamic. She had shown that progressive politicians didn't need approval from media elites. In fact, they might be better off without it. The interview sparked a broader conversation about the role of media in progressive politics. Young progressive activists who had been frustrated with what they saw as liberal media's timidity suddenly had a champion. Older progressives who remembered when the media was more adversarial began questioning whether personalities like Maddow had become too comfortable to establishment. The political impact was immediate and measurable. In the 48 hours following the interview, Crockett's campaign raised more money than it had in the previous 3 months combined. Small dollar donations poured in from across the country, with many donors specifically mentioning the Maddow interview in their contribution notes. Other progressive candidates saw similar bumps in fundraising, as donors energized by Crockett's performance decided to support politicians who would fight like Jasmine. The message was clear. Progressive voters were hungry for politicians who would challenge not just Republicans, but the entire political establishment, including liberal media. In the weeks that followed, the Crockett effect began reshaping progressive politics. Other young progressive politicians started adopting more confrontational approaches in their media appearances. Instead of trying to please liberal media hosts, they began pushing back against questions they saw as unfair or disconnected from their constituents' real concerns. The change wasn't limited to individual politicians. Progressive organizations began rethinking their media strategies, with many deciding to bypass traditional liberal media outlets in favor of direct communication with voters through social media and grassroots organizing. Major progressive groups like Justice Democrats and the Sunrise Movement announced new policies encouraging their endorsed candidates to be more confrontational with media personalities who they felt were undermining their message. Some organizations went even further, creating media accountability initiatives that tracked how often liberal media personalities questioned progressive politicians versus conservative ones, and how much time they spent criticizing progressive policies versus Republican policies. The data, when released, was shocking, and it validated many of Crockett's arguments about media bias within supposedly allied outlets. Liberal media outlets found themselves in an uncomfortable position. They had built their brands on being the voice of the resistance, but progressive politicians were increasingly treating them as part of the establishment they were resisting. The Crockett-Maddow confrontation marked a turning point in American progressive politics. It showed that the old media gatekeepers were losing their power to define the boundaries of acceptable political discourse. More importantly, it demonstrated that voters were hungry for authenticity over political calculation. Crockett's refusal to moderate her message for the sake of media approval resonated with millions of Americans who were tired of politicians who seemed more concerned with their media coverage than with fighting for real change. Beyond politics, the interview became a cultural touchstone. It was studied in journalism schools as an example of how traditional media interviews could go wrong. It was analyzed in political science classes as a case study in changing power dynamics between politicians and media. Young people who had never heard of either Crockett or Maddow before that night suddenly knew both names. For many of them, Crockett became a symbol of what political courage looked like, someone willing to speak truth to power even when that power was supposedly on their side. 6 months later, the interview was still being referenced in political discussions. Pulling a Crockett became shorthand for refusing to back down from media pressure. Getting Maddowed became a term for when a media personality got embarrassed by their own guest. But perhaps the most important legacy was the conversation it started about accountability, not just for politicians, but for the media personalities who interview them. Crockett had asked a simple but devastating question. When was the last time you had to make a real sacrifice for your political beliefs? It was a question that many viewers began asking about other media personalities, politicians, and political commentators. And often, they didn't like the answers they found. In the end, what made the Crockett-Maddow confrontation so powerful wasn't just the entertainment value of watching a media personality get taken down on live television. It was the substance behind the spectacle, a genuine argument about what progressive politics should look like and who gets to decide. Jasmine Crockett had walked into that MSNBC studio as a relatively unknown congresswoman from Texas. She walked out as the voice of a new generation of progressive politicians who refused to be told they were too radical for wanting to help working families. Rachel Maddow, meanwhile, never quite recovered her authority as a progressive voice. The interview had exposed something that many viewers had suspected but never seen proven: that some liberal media personalities had become more invested in maintaining their own status than in fighting for the changes they claimed to support. The 8-minute interview that was supposed to be about Democratic Party unity ended up revealing the deep divisions within progressive media and politics. And in those divisions, a new kind of political leadership was born, one that answered to voters, not to media gatekeepers. As Jasmine Crockett had said in her final moment on that set, "Maybe the problem isn't my message. Maybe the problem is that you've forgotten what this fight is actually about." It was a line that would echo through American politics for years to come, a reminder that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought against political opponents, but against the people who claim to be on your side but have forgotten why they started fighting in the first place. If this incredible political showdown showed you anything, it's that the real battles for America's future are happening right now, in real time. Jasmine Crockett proved that one person with courage and conviction can change the entire conversation, and that's exactly what we need more of in politics today. Her performance that night became a blueprint for how progressive politicians can handle hostile media, even when that hostility comes from supposedly friendly sources. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these explosive political moments. Because as we've seen, the most important confrontations often happen when you least expect them, and they can change everything in just a few minutes. The political landscape is shifting faster than ever, and the old rules about media deference and political politeness are being rewritten before our eyes. Share this video with anyone who needs to see what real political courage looks like and let us know in the comments. Do you think Crockett was right to challenge Maddow, or did she go too far? The conversation is just getting started, and your voice matters in shaping what comes next. The fight for America's future isn't happening in some distant future. It's happening right now, one confrontation at a time. And if this story proves anything, it's that the people willing to speak truth to power, even when that power claims to be on their side, are the ones who will ultimately win. The Crockett moment showed us that sometimes the most important political battles happen not in Congress or at campaign rallies, but in television studios where the narrative gets shaped.